Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And in today's episode, it's time to find out more about the Percy Tenantry Volunteers, the force of volunteer soldiers raised during the Napoleonic Wars by the Second Duke of Northumberland.
It's an annual April tradition to be joined on the podcast by Bill Openshaw and Nick Lewis to share their expertise on the Percy Tenantry Volunteers. Since their last appearance, Bill has published his first book, To the Call of Bugles, an in-depth history of the PTV, available to purchase in paperback from Alnwick Castle, as well as an ebook from your usual major online retailers.
Bill will also be appearing as a Percy Tenantry volunteer on various weekends throughout our 2024 visitor season. Please check the Alnwick Castle website for full details.
He joined us to tell us more about some of his favourite stories from the book and to be quizzed by Nick and by us about what he discovered while he was writing and researching it.
Here is our conversation. Please enjoy. So we're very happy to be joined once again on the Alnwick Castle Podcast by Bill Openshaw and Nick Lewis. How are you both?
Very good, thank you. It's good to be back.
Good to see you both. Hiya, Bill.
Hi, Nick.
Well, since your last appearance, Bill's book about the Percy Tenantry Volunteers has been published. We have a copy of To the Call of Bugles here with us. How does it feel to have the book out in the world, Bill?
It's nice. It was a long time coming, but now it's out there. It's good. I wanted to get the book out there to put the truth out about the Percy Tenantry. Over the years, I've heard different things, so that was the main driving force, if you like, to get the book out, to get the truth out there, and it's a part of British history that hasn't been written about much. So I wanted it to serve as an example of what the volunteers were doing at the period, just to try and fill in a hole in the gap of history, if you like. So yeah, it feels good. It's finally out there. And get to work on the next one.
Could you talk about some of your favourite stories of the book? Maybe start with the origins of who the PTV were.
I can jump in on this one and give Bill a bit of a breather. So the Percy Tenantry Volunteers were first conceived, I suppose, at the back end of the 18th century in 1798 in response to a really genuine and growing threat from the French Republic that was aggressively moving across continental Europe and dominating ultimately the European coastline. And as ever, when one individual power on the continent becomes dominant, the British government begin to consider defence and a response to any potential invasion. And even way up here on the northeast coast of England, the threat was real enough to elicit a response from central government in the form of militia units and indeed volunteers from centre, but also in this specific instance with the Northumberland estates and the second Duke of Northumberland, Hugh Percy. And we'll go on to talk about Hugh Percy, I suppose, in a minute, and we've done a whole podcast on him. But Hugh Percy was well placed to lead a unit like this, and not just from his military background, but also he was financially able and had the means to outfit a unit like this. And so it was the perfect calling for him, really. And even with the slight pause with the Peace of Amiens in 1803, the unit endured right through until the end of the Napoleonic Wars proper in 1814, notwithstanding the final campaign at Waterloo the following year. And so it's a story of a unit that developed over many, many years. There was many thousands of people involved, in both directly and indirectly, and almost the entire Northumberland estate, in terms of the land holding the Duke had, particularly in the northeast of England, was involved in this. So it's a major undertaking, a major story, and as Bill said, up until now, really, it hasn't been told in its entirety before.
Am I right in saying that when it all started to come about, there were fears or worries about invasion in the northeast? I remember you telling me once about newspaper reports about an attack in Blyth.
Well, there was a newspaper report that the French actually landed in Blyth, a small party, and they actually ransacked Delville Hall and ran off with various goods and things. That was the newspaper report, but in truth, it didn't quite happen. They didn't sack Delville Hall, but they think one of the lodges or something They certainly did land, a party of Frenchmen did land there, and they went off with some stuff. But there was a real plan to invade the northeast. The French did land in Wales in a place called Fishguard. We've spoken about it in previous podcasts. But part of this plan that the French came up with was to send a large force to Ireland, smaller forces the southwest, and another force to the northeast. But because of what happened to the force that was going to go to Ireland, the force that was coming to the northeast didn't actually turn up in the end, but they did in the southwest, and that was the last invasion of Britain. So there was a big fear that the French at any point could still land on the northeast coast. As you could imagine, the south coast was heavily defended, lots of regular troops, but there was miles and miles along sort of Northumberland coast that had very few troops, and it would have made a great landing ground for the French. But as we all know, they didn't come in the end, except for that small party at Blythe, yeah.
We know from previous episodes that the Percy Tenantry were led by the second Duke of Northumberland. As Nick mentioned, we've done an episode all about him, but he wasn't completely keen to be in charge of it at the very beginning.
No, he wasn't. What had happened it was the people of Alnwick tried to set up their own volunteer association. And the Dukes at the time thought there's no way that the French are going to land here. There was a big fear all around the country, but the Duke didn't fall for it. He thought it was just the government stirring up the fear so they could raise the taxes. Actually, that was his real thoughts, and he thought they're not going to happen. The force that the Alnwick people tried to raise, the offer was declined by the king. He didn't want them either. He wanted more troops on the coast rather than inland at Alnwick. But the pressure built up, and in the end, the Duke decided, okay, well, yes, I'll do it. I don't think the French are going to invade, but I'll raise a force. And he raised, as we all know, about 1,000 men in 1798, about 1,500 in 1803. He took it on, and to say, even as a soldier, he didn't really want to do it. He was sort of pressurized into doing it. But he was, at the end of the day, he was the best man for the job.
And in the book, you explain about how they were trained, which wasn't usual for the time of the infantry, was it?
No, certainly in 1798, most of the volunteer forces were being trained exactly the same or pretty close to the regular forces. Now, the way of fighting back then was to stand in lines and columns, and basically you just fire volleys at each other until one or the other ran. It worked great on the vast plains of Europe, but during the 7-Year War in the 1750s in America, of course, it's heavily wooded terrain. These tactics weren't working very well. So the British Army started developing Indian tactics. Instead of being in close lines, they were spread out using the cover of the trees and the terrain. It worked great. But after the war, it was forgotten about.
We should add there that you did some little air quotes around Indian tactics, because you're not talking about India, the South Asian.
No.
You're talking about the people who then would have been the American Indians.
Yes.
To the British.
Yeah. But it was called Indian tactics, Indian style of fighting. Come the American Revolution, again, they were in America. The Duke himself was on the receiving end of this sort of tactics. Again, we've explained before the Battle of Lexington, where the Americans pretty much surrounded the British using these tactics. And Percy did an amazing job of getting back the British troops all the way to Boston. So the British again started using light infantry tactics, as they were called now. Again, men spread out using the terrain. But after this war, again, it was forgotten about. So come 1798, when the Napoleonic Wars were starting to, or the Revolutionary War, should I say, was in full throw, there wasn't many troops fighting like this. As I said, most of the volunteers were trained to fight in line. The Dukes particularly thought that this was no good for volunteers. If they faced a professional French army, the French fired a volley at them, they'd probably just run for the hills. And he's probably true. So he thought he'd train his men in these Indian tactics, as we mentioned earlier. His idea was the men would use the terrain of Northumberland. They knew what the hills, the woods. His men would spread out. They would take pot shots at the French, surround them. His idea was they wouldn't get anywhere close to them. So you would inflict casualties on them, but they would find it difficult to inflict casualties on you. Came 1803, the penny had dropped with the British Army, and they also started developing these tactics more as well. So the Duke was a little bit ahead of his time. We'd probably call it guerrilla warfare these days. But it was a very effective way of fighting. He clothed them in green instead of red, which helped camouflage them in the woods of Northumberland, etc. So, yeah, he was well ahead of his time in training his men.
They were well trained. They were cared for, as we've talked about on previous episodes, but it wasn't all happy days all the time, because there was a pub brawl in around 1810. Can you tell us what happened in the pub brawl?
Yeah, well, alcohol played its part, as several stories where alcohol plays its part. Not just the Percy Tenantry. A few men were caught on duty, intoxicated and things like that. But I think what you're talking about is what happened in the Wall Bottle Company. It happened one evening. They'd been out exercising, and they returned to the local pub after exercise, where quite often they were actually paid at the pub. The story goes that two of the new corporals started talking about one of the men, Private Ramshaw, basically saying his drill, his exercise was pretty poor. Unfortunately, Ramshaw was actually sitting at the bottom of the table, and he overheard the corporals, and he took a bit of offence to this. And he basically said to the corporal that, "I'm going to knock your head off." Well, the corporal responded by saying something like, "You're an ugly-faced dog who could do his exercise no better than an ape." Well, of course, threw his ale into the corporal's face, and it all kicked off. Well, I guess must have been arrested, taken before the Justice of the Peace, and I think he was in a bit of a quandary of what to do. Evidently, if he'd taken the case, it probably would have got into the newspapers. It wouldn't have looked good for the Percy Tenantry, it wouldn't have looked good for the Duke. So the GP, the Justice of the Peace, passed it on to Earl Percy himself. His excuse was because they were in uniform at the time, it's probably more of a military affair than a civil case. So it was dealt in-house. It was passed on to the local captain, who got the men together, made Ramshaw and his comrades, who were also involved, apologise, and the corporal agreed to drop his charge of assault. So it all worked out well in the end. But I'm sure there was other episodes of that happened as well. But that's the only one we found that was actually recorded. So they weren't always best of mates.
Whose side are you on? Are you on Private Ramshaw's side or the corporals?
Oh, I think I'd be on the corporal's side, actually. If he can't get his exercise right, oof. Yes.
Would you be able to talk a little bit about the Battle of Brisley Tower that you mentioned in the book as well, and also maybe explain where that is?
I can do the second bit. Brisley Hill is in the park west of the town, northwest of the town. And on the hill, in the redesign of the parks, was built a tower in a Gothic style in 1781 by the Duke's father, the first Duke, Hugh Percy. Amidst the remodelling of the parks under works with Capability Brown particularly, it's supposedly a Robert Adam design, the tower, but there is, I think, some evidence that the Duke himself was involved in its design. He certainly put his own mark on the tower with quotes and inscriptions and things. And the tower in that period, so even in the early part of the 19th century, would have still been very visible from all around in the countryside, right around the town. It's quite heavily wooded now. Actually, not so much since Storm Arwen. You get maybe an idea of how it might have looked back in the Napoleonic period, but certainly back then it would have been a very obvious and very visible eye catcher on the horizon, or on the skyline, I suppose, above the town. And it's only just outside of Alnwick, so it's quite convenient, I suppose, as a mustering point, or even indeed as a landmark to be fought over potentially. And I wonder perhaps if that's what played into it. It is, of course, all part of the Duke's Parks as well, so very much a controlled environment for doing something like this. And yeah, it was there that I think in 1810, wasn't it, Bill, that particular exercise was held?
Now you've got me now. I think it was actually 1806. I think it was a little bit earlier, but you might be right. Yeah, so the battle itself, it had actually been carefully orchestrated. It wasn't like a free-for-all. There was probably around 700 or 800 perhaps men involved with it, from the Northern Division, and all the cavalry were there and the artillery. What they did, they actually split the force. So you had Earl Percy's men, and the other force were known as the Northern Band, supposedly coming from Scotland. And so basically, as I say, they had this carefully orchestrated battle in Brisley, which of course Earl Percy won. And then afterwards they all marched down into the pastures outside the castle, grand procession. The Duke was there, the District General was there, and lots of people watching, no doubt. It wasn't the only mock battle that took part in the northeast. I mean, there was lots of them all over the country, but there was a larger one at Throckley Fell in 1808. I believe there was about 3,000 or 4,000 involved with that one. Volunteers and regular forces from Sunderland, Gateshead and Newcastle all came together. There was one that I quite like. A small one happened at North Shields at Clifford's Fort. I believe about 3 regiments on the South Shields side came across in a mock attack on Clifford's Fort, which was held by the North Shields and Tynemouth volunteers. I believe the volunteers won at the point of bayonet. And I believe there was also one in Sunderland that ended up in fisticuffs, believe it or not, because both sides wanted to win. And yeah, it just ended up in a free-for-all. That was down in Hendon, near the Black Cats Battery, I hasten to add, which is where the football team today gets its nickname from. So yeah, it was a common sight throughout the country, and there were several mock battles in the northeast. And usually it was accompanied by hundreds and hundreds of spectators watching this fantastic spectacle. And it would have been just the same at Brisley Tower, and certainly down on the pastures, yeah.
And after consulting the book and Nick's checked as well, we can confirm 1805 is when the Battle of Brisley happened.
Near enough.
So we talked about Private Ramshaw just before. I'm going to ask about another private now. Who was Private Collingwood, and why would nobody stand next to him?
Well, Private Robert Collingwood, he was from Ellingham, and he was in the Newham Company. He was no relation to the great Admiral, I'll hasten to add. Now, it turned out we discovered the story because the captain had written to Earl Percy saying that this man was absolutely useless. He couldn't do anything. In fact, his rifle, is reported, exploded during exercise, that his powder flask had caught fire at one point and exploded. And as you can imagine, none of the other soldiers would stand next to him. And who can blame them? I can't believe there'd be somebody so bad, but he wasn't just a new recruit. He'd been in the ranks for several years, actually, so I don't know how it lasted so long. But evidently the company and the captain had had enough of them and asked if they could discharge him. Now, Earl Percy wasn't that keen on actually discharging him, which seems a bit strange. But Earl Percy had thought, well, this man has come forward to volunteer. He's doing his bit for the country. If we discharge him, it's going to be a bit of a black mark on his name. Couldn't you just try and talk him into leaving? That would be the better option. However, we learned that 6 months later, he's still in the ranks. One of the officers is having to load his rifle for him because he's still just as useless. So Lieutenant Colonel Smith gets involved and he has a quiet word with him. And because he's described as an old volunteer. Now, because I wondered, what did the word old mean? Did it mean in age, or he'd been in a long time? Well, the muster rolls reveal he wasn't in the volunteers in 1798, so I presumed it meant he was old by age. Now, most men, volunteers, would retire at the age of 60. So I was presuming he was probably about that age. But I did a little bit of digging on various family research sites, and the only Robert Collingwood I could find that would possibly fit was born in Ellingham in 1760. So at this point, it would only make him about 51, something like that. So he wasn't that old. Maybe they persuaded him that he's old enough. Because certainly the Percy Tenantry, I must admit, they appear not to like men over the age of 45. They preferred the younger, sprightly ones. So he did, and instead of being discharged, he retired honourably. So that's the way they got rid of them. And I'm sure the rest of the men were very pleased about that. But yeah, I can't believe that he couldn't do his duty. Being a reenactor, I know how easy it is to learn how to fire a musket, and to be completely incompetent like it sounds like he was, it's just beyond my imagination. But there you go. A real Corporal Jones, I think.
No, he sounds quite relatable to me.
Yeah.
So, Bill, when you were writing the stories and obviously researching all these different men, have you come up with any favourite stories or new pieces of information that you didn't know before you went into writing the book?
Well, yeah, there's several stories. I mean, that was one of my favourite ones. That's a good one. One story that we've probably mentioned before was the story of the drowning of one of the Percy Tenantry men. The story I'd heard was that after the muster one evening, he'd been to the local pub, rowing across the River Aln. Being dead drunk, he fell in the river and was drowned. That was the story, one of the myths. So it seemed that wasn't true at all. What had actually happened was, yes, they'd been to exercise. I don't know if they'd been drinking or not afterwards. It didn't really matter. It had nothing to do with it. It was a pure accident. The ferry was going across the River Aln, the Almouth. There was 3 Percy Tenantry men in the boat, a small young boy and the boatman. It hit a rope on one of the ships. The boat was capsized. 2 of the Percy Tenantry drowned. The other one was seen going down the river with his hanging onto the upturned boat, keeping his musket above the water. Good soldier. The poor old boatman was drowned as well. Fortunately, the young boy was washed towards the side and they managed to drag him out. So yeah, it's a very sad story. But again, it was one of the stories I could put in the book to dispel the myth of this drunk soldier falling in. But there are other small stories. A man called Thomas Townst was actually discharged because he was blind in one eye. It turned out, I looked at the muster rolls, it turned out he'd been in for a little while, 4 or 5 weeks. And I wondered, well, how is it's taken this long to discover, he's blind in one eye. I was thinking about it the other day and I thought, well, perhaps it was his left eye, so he could still shoot quite well with his aiming eye, as it were. But they discharged him, which might be a bit of a shame, because if he's lasted all that long, he's probably quite a good soldier. My favourite character I discovered was actually a man called Sergeant John Craven. You can actually write a book about him. Anybody who's familiar with the Sharp series, well, Craven was a real live Sharp. He served with the 95th Rifles. He was at the Battle of Copenhagen. He was honoured with a medal of valour by Lord Nelson himself. But because he was wounded, he was discharged from the army. But at the recommendation of the commanding officer of the 95th, he ended up being the Sergeant Major of the Percy Tenantry. Very, very useful man. Knew all the rifle tactics. Perfect for this elite corps of volunteers. There's lots of stories, but I think those are probably some of my favourite little ones. I don't know if Nick's got any others.
Just from reading your book, Bill, and these weren't anything that I'd come across in my research on the tenantry, which was barely scratching the surface. I was fascinated by the post-war story that you tell. And even the story beyond the special constables, which I think we touched on in the first podcast we did on the tenantry. I was fascinated particularly by the stockpiling of weapons at the castle by the third Duke in the 1820s and 30s in response to, again, a perceived threat, this time from internal enemies or potential enemies. And I think there's a quote in the book where someone mentions the potential for riot and revolution. And this comes, I suppose, against the backdrop of the discussions in Parliament around the Corn Laws. It comes eventually around the Great Reform Act in the 1830s. And even you can see the legacy of the Napoleonic Wars and the economic and social difficulties that follow that. So I was fascinated to see that the Duke was reinforcing his house, essentially, against these potential threats. And we know, like, on a slightly wider scale, that the Royal Artillery were inevitably, after the closure of such a long war, reducing numbers in this area. So, for example, the guns at Berwick and Holy Island were being reduced in numbers. The soldiers were being reduced in numbers. And it is interesting to think that the Duke was potentially responding to that. You know, the government aren't going to protect life and property, so I'll do it. And and again, something else I hadn't realised, that some of the artillery pieces that are visible on the castle's gun terrace today date from this period that were being sort of gathered, I suppose. Not just weapons, but ammunition. And I think, Bill, you particularly stressed the stockpiling of canister shot, grape shot, which has a very kind of real and sinister flavour to it when you think of what that stuff can do to a mass of people. And that the Duke was maybe considering, and when I say the Duke here, this is Earl Percy we're talking about from the tenantry period, in his later role as third Duke, that he was potentially going to be asking his gunners to turn their guns on their neighbours in a potential social and political revolution in Britain. So that's really fascinating. We can obviously look back with hindsight and know that didn't happen, but at the time, the very fact that he was willing to make those decisions and willing to sign those receipts, I suppose, for stockpiling that sort of weaponry was not something I'd come across before.
Since finishing the book, have you either deliberately or accidentally discovered more things? And is there room for a few appendixes at the end of a future edition?
Well, in the actual original book, there was an appendix to start off with. But the publisher wanted me to cut the book by over 30,000 words. Unfortunately, I did, and the appendix was one of them that had to go. So yes, there's the answer. There could be an appendix. The full version of the book is actually stored in the archives. The archivist, Chris Hunnick, has actually got the full version with little bits that I've added since the book was published. As you say, yeah, I have found other small bits, nothing extraordinary, but just little bits of interest. From a personal point of view, though, one of the things I wanted to do was try and find images of the men that actually served. So I have been on a bit of a quest, and since the book, I've found 3 or 4 more images of them. One of them was a Captain Atkinson of the Newham Company. I found an image of him in full British uniform. He'd actually served in India before the Revolutionary Wars. 2 others were brothers, Joseph and Humble Lamb, from the Newcastle area. One was a captain of the cavalry troop and one of an infantry company. They were both very well-known local businessmen, and Joseph actually went on to become Mayor of Newcastle. So another celebrity, if you like, was discovered amongst the many of the Percy Tenantry. But yeah, I'm always on the lookout for more stories. It's research is never complete.
Now, moving on to when the castle is open, this is going out during our open season in April. And when visitors come to the castle, there might be some times where they meet a member of the PTV. Could you tell a little bit about what they might expect whilst they're here?
Well, this year I'm sure you'll have a good chance of coming across the Percy Tenantry. I think this year we're putting on some sort of Percy Tenantry display at least once a month. There'll be an artillery firing display, and also the Percy Tenantry will be in. I'll be donning full Percy Tenantry uniform, and I'll be aided and abetted by a couple of volunteer reenactors who'll be wearing the uniform of the British Army and of the Percy Tenantry. And what we'll be doing basically is explaining why the Percy Tenantry came into being, what was so different about them, and we'll be able to show the difference, describe what the British Army were doing, what they were wearing, and then counter that with what the Percy Tenantry were doing and wearing. So if anybody likes to see muskets being fired, check their website and find out when we're there. Also, in addition to that, I believe there's going to be some of our actors in the castle are going to be doing little vignettes of the Percy Tenantry, a little bit more light-hearted, telling the stories in a light-hearted manner, very entertaining. I'm sure it's going to be. I haven't actually seen it yet, but I'm sure it will be. So yes, we have a lot of Percy Tenantry content over the coming season. So I'm looking forward to it for one anyway.
Yes. I am too.
Me too. And those stories have all been inspired by what is in To the Call of Bugles, your book, Bill. So we now have to ask, what have you got planned? What's the next book?
Well, it's at the beginning of the book, I talk about the second Duke and his involvement in America, which is very important to why the Percy Tenantry were trained in the way they did, and uniforms, etc. Within the castle archives, there were literally hundreds and hundreds of documents from that period to do with the Earl Percy as he was then. About 100 years ago, there was a book written, Letters from America. There were Earl Percy's letters. And I discovered that most of the letters in that book weren't from the castle archives. There was only a few. So I thought, well, you've got all these documents, hundreds of them, that have never been published. And with the 250th anniversary coming up next year of the Battle of Lexington, and then the commemoration of the Declaration of Independence the following year, I thought it would be an ideal time to publish those letters. So at the moment, I'm transcribing them. I've nearly finished, and then I'll be putting them together and forming them into some sort of book. I'm not sure the format of the book, but I quite like the idea of just doing it chronologically, so you'd read things as they were happening, and you're seeing the war through Earl Percy's eyes, as it were. It appears there's not many books have been written about the American Revolution from British point of view. There are a couple. Most of them are from the American point of view, so it'd be nice to read something from the British point of view and those rebels.
Good. Before we finish, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Any other stories that have come up in your mind that you think the listeners should know? Doesn't have to be. Just in case you had anything written down that you haven't mentioned yet.
There was only one other note I had written down that there was a couple actually, but the one particular one was I find it interesting. Bill's searching for images of particularly officers in the tenantry, in a way as if to bring them back to life again. And I know there was quite a moving part towards the end of your book, Bill, where you talk about the tenantry column and how, unlike the First World War Memorial just down the hill from the tenantry column, there isn't really any representation of the men themselves in the town, apart from the glass jar with the muster roll that's buried under the tenantry column, which we'll never see probably. But the hunt for images of these men is one way of kind of rediscovering their faces a little bit, or their identities. And indeed, Bill's book is probably the best way of doing that. But it occurred to me the other day that it's quite interesting that the development that's currently going on outside the Barbican of Alnwick Castle, the hotel at the top of Bailiff Gate, is the house of Lieutenant Colonel Smith. And isn't it interesting that I guess in years to come, many visitors to Alnwick who may well buy Bill's book and head back to the hotel may well be sitting down to read it with a cup of coffee and a complimentary biscuit in the very house that belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Smith of the Tenantry Volunteers that they may well be reading about. And I thought that was quite pleasing, given that there are, apart from the Tenantry column, very few surviving memorials to them, to the men and to the unit. So that made me smile.
Yeah, the thing about the column was originally there was going to be some inscription talking about the Percy Tenantry themselves, the volunteers, but for some reason it was never put in there. Most locals would know about the sealed muster roll that's at the bottom there, but I doubt many visitors to the area would know about them. that's one of the things I'm still doing at the moment. I actually decided to put together my own muster roll. I've got over 2,000 names at the moment and counting, because we tend to think that, oh, well, there was 1,500 men served. But the thing was that number was changing constantly. So I wouldn't be surprised if the total number that actually served with the Percy Tenantry was probably closer to 3,000 men. So it would be nice to record as many names as possible. Yeah. So that's an ongoing project.
I wonder with that new lighting installation projection around the column, whether it would be possible somehow to get those names on the column one way or another in a non-permanent way, Bill. So,
you never know. Perhaps at some anniversary they'll be able to do that. Yeah, it would be nice to honour the men in some way. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us once again, Nick and Bill, on the Alnwick Castle Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Cheers.
If you'd like to find out more about the Percy Tenantry, not only is Bill's book To the Call of Bugles out now, but you can see him in person and in uniform this year at the castle. Once again, check our website for all the dates.
You can also head back into our podcast archive for our other episodes featuring Bill and Nick. Look for episode 9, The Percy Tenantry Volunteers, and episode 32, The Second Duke of Northumberland.
Join us for another podcast in 2 weeks' time, where we'll be joined by another of our favourite returning guests to find out more about William Shakespeare and the Wars of the Roses. Until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.